Tonight, we will be talking about Catholic social teaching. So this will be very much an extension of what we talked about last week with Christian ethics. It kind of flows right out of it. So here's how we're supposed to behave. And then this is, we take this out into the world, how we behave in society, how do we live the teaching, especially with all the things that go on in the world as different ages pop up or different ages pass by, new problems pop up. How do we address those? And so using scripture and morality and church teaching, we come up with some principles. We'll go to the principles near the end, but we'll start with where Catholic social teaching comes from, namely scripture. So in the Hebrew scriptures, we talked a little bit last week about the social nature of the Hebrew scriptures, and those scriptures very much outline how the people were supposed to live in society, in relationship with God and one another. And that relationship was very key. It was virtue for the Greeks, but for the Hebrews, relationship was key. How you live in society was very key. And so they had all these prescriptions. They had all the laws. Not all the laws had to do with how to treat each other in society, but many of them did. And what happened when you didn't follow those commandments, right? And it's, again, the social aspect. Ethics are a social thing. There's no such thing as some private morality for the Hebrews. And there's a focus, right? There's, especially in Deuteronomy, there's this calling out of these vulnerable segments of the population who we want to show love, mercy, and hospitality. And there's groups: the widows, the orphans, the foreigners, the aliens, the ones who are on the outside. We show them treatment. They're specifically called out. And this task is given to the leaders of the people of Israel. Right? You have the kings, who are the rulers. Some of them good, many of them bad. You have the judges. First there were judges and no kings. So the original judges, like Samson, Gideon, you read in the book of Judges, but they are resolving disputes. They're how's the law applied? There's the priests, who are leading the people in public worship and following out those things. And then unique from those groups are the prophets, that are speaking on behalf of God, called by God to speak to the people and to call them to conversion, challenge them to adhere to God's law. Often they were called forward when the people were not adhering to God's law. So there's something separate from the rulers and the priests, and they are the ones who are admonishing the people, calling them back. And of course, when you're admonishing someone, you're probably not going to be super popular. So we know Jeremiah, Elijah, none of the prophets were particularly popular with the people at the time. Looked back with some fondness, but they're called back, to live the covenant of the Lord. Hey, you're not living the covenant out. You're exploiting the people. You might be following the ritual law, the purity law, but you're not following the commands to treat the widow and the orphan with respect, to bring in the people. The morality is not there in the aspects of following the law. Again, these special treatment, calling out where are you exploiting the most vulnerable. And so Israel really gets caught up in this cycle of being in this state of blessing. They become owners. They form society. They get their kings. They get their judges, and then they start forgetting the poor. And then in forgetting the poor, they start to forget God. They forget Yahweh. And to fill that vacuum, they create other gods, or they worship other gods, the gods of the surrounding people. This causes some sort of self-destruction. They start battling among themselves. They start suffering. The prophets come to remind them, hey, this is happening, God, because you've turned away from God, and you've turned away from the poor first. So it's not just following the law, but you need to take care of the poor. They kill the prophets. They cry out for some sort of deliverance, and God says, well, I've sent the prophets, but I'll still restore you. Though he sends some sort of judge. He sends someone and restores them to that state of blessing. And this cycle goes around and around. And the prophets are, very clear. Woe to you who to enact unjust statutes and write decrees. You make the widows their plunder, orphans prey. This is the first 39 chapters of Isaiah, a ton of Jeremiah, the prophets. Again, they're repeated again and again. In Amos, he's calling out the people who are taxing the destitute. You've exploited people. You've done crimes. You hate people. You're turning away the people who are speaking with integrity. You're turning away the prophets. I know your crimes. You're oppressing people. Turn back. Break out of this cycle. Turn back. It's again and again. The prophets are calling them into this. And this goes right into Jesus. And it's Jesus who's going to step in to break that cycle, or at least insert himself into the cycle as a way to bring people back. That restoration is a more complete restoration with Jesus. And so with this, Jesus holds this threefold office, which we are brought into in baptism: priest, prophet, and king. So the priest able to offer sacrifice. The king is that there's this inheritance, this identity of the Son of God, and a prophet calling out, doing what the Hebrew prophets did, call out the people for their corruption and speak truth to the situation going around them. And we're called into that. And so Jesus lives out this role as prophet in numerous ways, right? Constantly challenging the systems of injustice that are going on, that are either from the Romans, but mostly from within the Hebrews' own system with the Pharisees, the Sadducees. I'm talking about the Sabbath, the lepers, whatnot. And part that was, it built up for various reasons, some of them good, but Jesus is there to break them out of that cycle. So he challenges them, he critiques the leaders, he makes them feel, of course, very uncomfortable, to the point where they kill him. One of the reasons that they kill him is that, again, it's the same reason they killed the prophets, right? And he's at points in the gospel are very clear, especially in Luke, when it comes to the poor. Instead of saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, he's, blessed are the poor, and woe to you who are rich. Woe to you who have been filled and aren't hungry anymore. Woe to you who laugh, for you grieve and weep. It was really calling out this thing of people taking joy. Not necessarily they were taking joy in other people's suffering, but they were ignoring the vulnerable of the population to build up themselves. And so he's calling them out. And this role of prophet, of calling those injustices out, that specific aspect of being a prophet, of calling those injustices out, is passed on to the church. And the church shares that prophetic office, not only as a whole, but on the individual level. So we are all prophets calling out the injustices of society where people are being exploited, and that the understanding, and you being that witness in the world. And the early church took this, very seriously. So, for example, Saint Basil the Great, who you see here, says, "The bread you store up belongs to the hungry. The cloak that lies in your chest belongs to the naked. The gold you have hidden in the ground belongs to the poor." So, calling out people who are hoarding things and taking them for themselves when others do not have those things. So again, not railing against ownership and property and having things, but it was in the excess. And it's Saint Basil the Great who, along with the other Cappadocian fathers, who set up the first hospitals, the first concept of hospitals, of taking care of the poor and the sick and bringing in the experts who could do healing and things like that. So the St. John Chrysostom is in the same vein as St. Basil, of, again, calling out these excesses. And if you have two cloaks, that second cloak, it belongs to the poor. And so this early church fathers now, and then the church fathers, they're certainly teaching things of how the Christian behaves in the world, but the real development of Catholic social teaching doesn't really come out until pretty recent in the life of the church, because mostly society was Christian. It was with the same with the Hebrews. It was kind of intertwined of, everyone was Christian. So, it just was part of the way you lived. And so it's, the Christians were doing things, and the church would react, but it was all kind of one and the same. In the modern period, where there's more of a separation of the church and the state, there's more of a call for the church to respond to these things. So not to say that there weren't atrocities and things happening in the Middle Ages or the early church history, but the church, the development, it happens more in the recent period. So the landmark document in Catholic social teaching is called Rerum Novarum. It was issued by Pope Leo XIII right at the end of the 19th century. So the Rerum Novarum on the rights and duties of capital and labor. And it's the first modern social encyclical. Now, an encyclical is a letter that's from the Pope, and it's sent to all the bishops of the world. And by being for all the bishops, it's for all the people of the church, all the people of the world, on some particular topic. And these are still issued. They have been issued. The popes throughout time, they still are being issued. There's a number of different documents. Just as a note on encyclical titles, the title is always going to be in Latin, and it's all it is the first 2 or 3 words of the document. I should say it's not always in Latin. Sometimes it's other languages, German or Italian or something like that. But it's always, so it's the first 2 words or 3 words of the document. There's nothing unique in the, it's not, the title is how it starts. So what is this? Why does he issue this encyclical? Well, we're in the midst of the industrial revolution, which is sweeping throughout Europe, particularly the United States, many places across the world. There's, of course, the steam engines, this new electric lighting, the assembly line, especially with Henry Ford, and a lot of urbanization. So people are flocking to the cities, and there's no, before you're moving, you had this more agrarian society, and you have this rapid growth of industrial production, and there's not really any governance of it, and there's a lot of money involved. So there's, of course, with that comes greed and exploitation. And so the church sees there's this rapid growth. It's not being checked in terms of some of the violations that are happening. And so what are we going to do? There's an exploitation of the workers. There's very inhumane conditions. I think an example, and I forgot to look up the name of the title, but there's that book by Upton Sinclair about the Chicago meatpacking plants in this time, and this is the awful conditions that are there. And part of he wrote that, and there was a lot of reform that came out of that. Him writing that book about about that. And the name is escaping me. I'm sorry, but yeah, Upton Sinclair is the one who wrote that. And then you have a lot of child labor, of course, is going on. So what does Rerum Novarum attempt to do? What does it say? So it says, working men have been surrendered, isolated, and helpless. They've been surrendered? They're helpless, and the employers are exploiting. There's a hard-heartedness, and there's this greed of unchecked competition, which you can understand. It happened, right? There's the wild frontier that go as fast as you can. Technology is exploding, and again, there's nothing that's checking this. And the means of production, the capital, it's being restricted to a small number of rich men. Right. This is something you'll see that this document is constantly revisited, and many of the things that are in there are still a problem today, or at least still addressed today. So they've maybe been addressed in some way, but they're not perfect today. Over 100 years later. So workers are not to be treated as slaves. There's a dignity of the human person, right? It's this is, like we talked about last week, rooted in the dignity of the human person. It created an image and likeness of God. That dignity needs to be respected. It's shameful and inhuman to use men as things for gain. This is kind of I would say the key line of Rerum Novarum that we to take forward, that is again constantly revisited in using men for gain and profit instead of treating them as human beings, right? And we see again that today of, I mean, with the issue of, this happens after slavery is abolished in the United States, but that's all this is tapped into, in using people as things instead of treating them as people. And so it looks at it's the principles that what it does in the end is it gives a critique of both unfettered capitalism. So it says, capitalism it's not a bad thing. It doesn't just say, get rid of capitalism, but right, unchecked capitalism is a problem. Also a problem is socialism, and if the society owns every means of production, there's a goodness of private property, right? There's a right to private property, but not this is a continuation of Aquinas, who said the same thing. But there's that when they discuss that, there's still that discussion that the light of Saint Basil and Saint John and Chrysostom of, it's a right to property that you need, not the excess, a right to a living wage, the ability to unionize. Of course, the unions were very big at the time in terms of protecting rights, humane conditions, hours, and the ability to work. And then what is the state's role in doing this? Right, the state has a role in making sure that these things are protected, because if we just leave it in the hands of the businesses, it will continue. So the state needs to step in and do this. And so there's a number of encyclicals that are issued during this time, right around in the early 20th century, of again revisiting these topics as things grow and the world changes. How is the church responding? So the first one's Quadragesimo Anno. So after 40 years, it's a follow-up. Looking 40 years later, let's look back at Rerum Novarum. What have we done? What still needs work? And in 1937, Pope Pius XI issues two. So one is Divini Redemptoris, right, condemning communism. So there's Rerum Novarum was really capitalism and socialism. Let's condemn communism, specifically the atheistic aspects of communism and what's happening in the Soviet Union. And then this Mit Brennender Sorge this would be actually German, is starting to discuss, there's this rise of Nazis, of National Socialism, of Nazism in Germany, and how do we deal with that? What critiques do we have of this? Now there was a concordance, there was an agreement between the Vatican and the Church and the Nazi Party in terms of what the Church could do in Germany. The concordance are an interesting thing. It allows the Church to operate, but maybe not on the freest of terms, but it does guarantee a church presence. So there'd be a whole discussion about the pros and cons of these agreements with these less than favorable governments. All right, so Quadragesimo Anno, what is it saying? Right, it's still talking about living wage, this adequate wage to be able to raise a family, right? Again, going back to the state. So what is the state doing? Protecting the interests of all, and let's really have the state make sure that they're looking at the poor. So this is not to say that the poor and the weak are more sacred than the rest, but they're more threatened. They're more vulnerable. They're more directly threatened by what's happening based on this, on communism, on socialism, on capitalism. They're the ones that are most threatened by these systems. So let's make sure these people are very much protected. Not that their lives are more sacred in some way. right? The market alone can't be left to determine the value of work. Now, of course, this document is in coming after the Great Depression, or during the midst of the Great Depression, after the stock market crash and all that. So, how do we, there needs to be protections from that. It's again affecting the poor, right? And really saying that due to the human greed, due to sin, due to the natural tendency to sin, the powerful and the rich, if you just let them be, they'll exploit the weak and the poor. Now, you might say, well, this is a pretty cynical view of the church, or cynical view by the church, but I think our experience shows that 99 times out of 100 that this is going to happen, whether it's on purpose or not. But there's an exploitation of the weak and the poor if there's not some sort of intervention, right? And that acts of charity are good and they need to be done and they should be done, but there does need to be some sort of grander view and justice and done on a more societal level, and the structures of society need to be changed so as to promote justice. There's also this, I don't know if you call it an introduction, but a stress on the principle, what's called the principle of subsidiarity, which is really saying that things should be done on the lowest level possible, on the most local level possible, is where the governance and checks and balances should be done. So you go as big as you need to. Sometimes those things can't be done on a local level and they need to be changed on a much wider scale. We think of the issue of slavery, perhaps. But if you can solve it on a local level, go to the lowest level possible. And this is still something that we hold today, this principle of subsidiarity. And this is not to say that one political party today is more right than the other. I think they both do a pretty terrible job of this, to be perfectly honest. But to stress that at a local level is where we want to have these things happen, if at all possible. Right, and here's Pius. Here's Pius the 11th. Continuing in this document, Quadragesimo Anno. So again, the economic life, it treated as it's free thing. It's there's a goodness in the freedom of the market. There's a goodness in competition. There's it has its own benefits, but if it's just unchecked free competition that's unlimited, we can't just let these be unlimited and go wherever they want. And there needs to be some sort of restriction, some check, some limit on these things. Pius is the 11th is also having to deal with the rise of Nazism. So he and the church write this document, Mit Brennen der Sorge, and among many things, going after this exaltation of one race over another that we're very familiar with. The Nazis did with the Aryan race, with all the genetic cleansing, the genocide that happens with the Holocaust, the Shoah, and this is before this is really in full swing. But they're saying that here's the thing: this can't be done, right? The church is speaking out clearly against Nazism. I mean, the church in the midst of World War II, people have blamed would eventually be Pius XII in World War II of not doing enough for the Holocaust. What did they know? Could they have done more? There's a lot of historians who do debate. What did the church do enough? It seems to me there's plenty of stories of the church harboring fugitives and Jews and whatnot in the Vatican. There's a great movie, by the way, if you ever want to see. It's a fictionalized retelling of this guy, Monsignor. Is it Flattery or O'Flattery? It's called The Scarlet and the Black. I highly recommend it. It's a fantastic movie. It's Gregory Peck and Christopher Plummer, and it's about the occupation, the Nazi occupation of Rome, and how does the Vatican and the church respond to that. It's a brilliant movie. So if you want to check that out, it's a great one. So after World War II, right, we move into the 60s, a very volatile time, but this is also when Vatican II is happening, and all it starts with the papacy of John the 23rd, Funny enough, he was elected, and he was viewed when he was elected as this placeholder pope, this bridge pope. He wasn't going to do a lot of stuff. He was older when they elected him, and he'll just bide his time while we wait for kind of the next pope to be ready to go. Instead, he calls this Ecumenical Council, which is we're still unpacking the things that happened at Vatican II. Elected in 1958, Vatican II starts in 1962 is when it starts. It lasts for over 3 years. But he viewed these humanitarian crises firsthand. He sees the horrors of World War II. He sees what it did to Europe. These awful, awful wars among supposedly Christian nations. And so, what does it say about how the church is living in the world if Christian nations can do this to each other? And so he issues this document, Mater et Magistra, excuse me. The church is the mother and the teacher, and he goes right after the social issues of the time, and specifically social progress. Social progress is a good thing, but again, like things being unchecked in economics, you can't just have unchecked social progress. We're seeing maybe some of the issues of that today, of just progress for progress's sake. And so again, he goes back to what does Rerum Novarum say, and he pulls things from that. There's a praise for the potential of science and technology for increasing the standard of living, but there's what does it say about what's going to do to the human person? Does it restrict human freedom? What about TV and radio and media? What about the ability to, with religious freedom? Like what we have to worry about, think about these things as technology is going forward. So the scientific advances, some new agricultural practices, how we deal with this post-World War II, this post-colonialism mindset that we had, all the mass communications. Of course, we're in the midst of the Cold War, so the threat of nuclear war is kind of constantly hanging over the world. And so there's 3 big documents that come out during the time of Pope John the 23rd, or thanks to his action. So Pacem in Terris, peace on earth. He lays out many rights that human beings have: the right to life, the right to be trained in morality, to learn morality, the right to be able to be part of a culture, to enact that culture. Again, not just to not the culture can do anything, but that you have a right to be part of this culture. You have a right to worship God. You see the religious freedom aspect there. The right to choose, what you do in life, your state in life. All the economic rights that you have. The right to meet, associate. The right to immigrate and emigrate, and political rights. Laying out that the church believes in these rights. The church will fight for these human rights. And then when it comes to the actual Second Vatican Council, the 2 big documents for rights and humanity are in one, Gaudium et Spes, which translates as joy and hope, but it's the big pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. JP2, John Paul II, he's very involved in the sacrament. He uses a lot in his papacy. But looking at all these different, again, aspects, how does the church interface with the modern world? What are the issues of the modern world? How is the church addressing them? And then Dignitatis Humanae is talking all about religious freedom. This is probably the most controversial document of the Second Vatican Council. There's still groups today that are either adjacent to the church or in the church who have issues with what the church said about religious freedom here and what that says about the truth of Christianity. That's for a different another day. All right, so again, it's Pacem in Terris. This, like I said, the rights of people, life, integrity, ability to develop life the way that I want. Again, it's not that I'm not doing it in any way that I want, but it's suitable to developing my life, and that I have these basic needs that are met. right? What else does Pachamenteris say? Nuclear weapons should be banned. Absolutely, right? There's a lot of discussion over the use of them to end World War II. There's the threat, there's in the midst of this is the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the nuclear war just hanging over the world, and the terror that puts in people, particularly the poor. What's going to happen to the poor if this somehow, God forbid, happened. Gaudium et Spes also mentions the arms race, right? One of the greatest curses of the human race. That's very strong language, particularly because the harm it inflicts on the poor is more than can be endured, right? This is not just between nations, right? It affects all people. Gaudium et Spes is, looking into any insult in human dignity, names some specifically subhuman living conditions. Perhaps you've seen some of these firsthand in some third world countries. This is certainly what someone like Mother Teresa specifically went to fight and to aid. But arbitrary imprisonment, deportation, slavery, prostitution, human trafficking, poor working conditions, and again, this language of where men are treated as mere tools for profits, and the language of coming from Kant, actually, of the ends not justifying the means, and that human beings can never be used as a means to some end. Right? They're free and responsible persons. And then they bring back in the church fathers. This is very big in Vatican II. A lot of calling back to the church fathers and what do the church fathers have to say? Feed the people dying of hunger, but because if you do not feed them, you are killing them. That's very strong language, but it harkens back to what St. Basil says of, if the bread you store up, it's not for you, it's really for the poor. And you shouldn't be storing it up, you should be giving it to the poor. And as we move into this post-Vatican II world, so it's taking what we learned in Gaudium et Spes particularly, but how are we applying that to the world? So it starts with Saint Paul VI, recently canonized. So 4 big documents that he issued. One, Populorum Progressio, right, on development of peoples. Humanae Vitae, this landmark document on contraception. This is a really, truly a prophetic document. If you've ever read it, truly it calls out if contraception is widely used in the world, here's what's going to happen. And you read it and you're like, well, yes, that's exactly what happened. And many people in the church wanted contraception to be a thing. Pope said no, and turns out he was very right. So again, this is a big thing for him. Autogesima Adveniens, right? A call to action, and this is, again, if you look at the date, what is this Octo Gesima? 80 years. So this is 80 years since Rerum Novarum. Another callback to how are we doing with Rerum Novarum? We're not doing so good. Okay, let's redouble our efforts and really look at where we're lacking. And then Evangelii Nunciandi, right? Evangelization in the modern world. How does the church interact with the modern world? How are we telling people about Jesus? How are we doing that and helping the poor? Saint John Paul II was huge in social justice issues, particularly because he witnessed again firsthand of what these unjust systems can do. As brought up in Poland, in communist Poland, had to be ordained and trained as a priest underground. Many of his family are killed, and so he's essential in the eventual fall of communism in the world, and or at least the downturn of it with the Soviet Union. But here's a few documents that he comes out with. Laborum Exercens, right, talking about human work and the goodness of work and the need to work and the beauty of work, but that work, there's a dignity of work, but that is not all man is meant to be, right? There's a leisure, there's recreation that comes as part of that, and that work should be dignified and dignifying, right? Solicitudo re socialis, just and social concerned. Here we go again. Call back to Rerum Novarum, Centissimus Annus, the 100th year, 100 years later, 100 years after Rerum Novarum. Again, how are we doing? Veritatis Splendor. This is a huge document. We actually talked a lot about it last week, whether you knew it or not, in morality and how the church deals with moral theology. This document is essential. Veritatis Splendor. Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life. And then shortly before he dies, he has the church issue this compendium of the social doctrine of the church, kind of laying out some of the principles that we're going to go over later. Right, just specifically, what are some things that he talks about? So, on a just wage, again, very, very pertinent for our current society. It's enough for one working parent to raise a family on. It includes, it's not just a wage, but there's access to healthcare, benefits, retirement. Again, it's not just the privilege to have this, that it's everyone has access to this. And that it allows for vacation leaver. It's not punishing people who have to work a lot. Again, there's issues here that you might be, fighting your mind. Wow, this is not being followed very, very well. Also, not punishing women for having children. I mean, that's huge in the United States right now of maternity benefits and things like that, and the ease of having children in our society. It's not quite there. And John Paul II does his own looking at the ends and the means. Workers' rights cannot be doomed to be the mere result of economic systems aimed at maximum profits. It's not just an end that we just do this for profits, and that profits are the only thing that driving this. When he's talking about immigrants, again, same working rights as native-born citizens, not to be exploited in economic ways, exploited in social ways, compensated based on the value of their work in the country they're in, not based on where they're coming from. And he's very clear on this in this Laborum Exercens. We've got Benedict XVI, who's criticized of not being socially aware or only caring about church doctrine. Could not be further from the truth. There's many things he's talking about, the care of the earth and immigration and all these things. So two big documents for him. Deus Caritas Est, his first encyclical, and then Caritas in Veritate, right? Talking about charity and love. And yes, there's a doctrinal aspect to it, but it's how is that lived out? The poor. It's Pope Benedict that says that the church exists for 3 reasons: to worship God, to evangelize, and to take care of the poor, to care for the poor. And the poor being not just the material poor, but the suffering, the marginalized, right? There's the poor in some aspect in their life. And then we have Pope Francis now, and he's, again, a lot of social things on his plate and what he's really stressed. So it starts off with the Evangelii Gaudium, again, the joy of the gospel, again, talking about the living out, the evangelization. It is very much tied into care of the poor. Laudato Si, talking about our care for the common home, the desire to make sure that we take care of our planet. Criticized by many for this. I mean, unfortunately, all these things are politicized, right? And so it gets tied up with the politicization of climate change and all this stuff. But besides just talking about the caring for the planet, again, Laudato Si, spends a huge portion discussing the exploitation of people and the not treating people as objects and not treating people as things to be thrown away and discarded. Right? He really goes after this culture of discarding, of throwing away what's not needed. And yes, that's objects, but it's also, he explains it to people, and that cannot be done. Talking about the family, big in Amoris Laetitia, and very recently he just released Fratelli Tutti on talking about fraternity and social friendship and solidarity and how we interact with our neighbor. The USCCB, the Bishops' Conference, has, of course, issued a number of letters. You can, if you want to go to their website, you can see all these documents. We've been talking about all the encyclicals I've mentioned, and then a number of these letters that they've issued. Just clear statements on where the church falls with these things. They always release. Well, recently they've been releasing voting guides. They call them Forming Conscience for Faithful Citizenship. Of how do you approach helping to enact policies, and how do you do that? How do you form your conscience? We talked about conscience last week, of course. All right, so this has gotten us to, what are the principles of Catholic social teaching? When we are approaching these social issues that are affecting some aspect of society, all of society, what are the principles for approaching this? So there's 7 themes that we're going to go over as we finish up here. Life and dignity of the human person, the call to community and family, rights and responsibilities, the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, dignity of work and the rights of workers, solidarity, and care of creation. These are all aspects of social teaching principles that we use to address these things. So there's a both and with Catholic social teaching. There's charity. There's that I can do on a more private individual level, and how do I treat my neighbor? Where am I helping the poor in my own life? It's more on that personal level. And then the justice level is a little more overarching, and how am I supporting positive change to these systems of justice and the way that the system is in order to benefit and do these things. So it's not either or. They're not opposed. It's not, why you don't bother with the charity on an individual level, that the system is working against them. Well, I can still do charity, and I can work to fix it, to help fix the system at the same time. Right? Obviously, the second one is difficult thing to do by yourself. And so there's this in social encounters, right? There's this observe, judge, act aspect. So we observe what's happening. We eventually want to act, but these principles are coming in really much in the judge phase. How do we judge what we see, and how does that inform how we're going to act? And this is a note that we should never disagree as Catholics, these moral principles, not just these principles I'm going to mention now, but all morality, right? That we don't disregard aspects of these moral principles, and we don't disagree over them, but we can discuss how we enact these things, right? The act phase is not some clear-cut thing. So how do we these principles, how do we get them into society? How do we act them out? Like, there's different ways to do that. So we can discuss what's the best way. I think people, again, this is an area of a lot of conflict and controversy, that we can only do it one certain way. Well, that's not quite true. So the first principle is all about dignity of the human person, and this is the foundation. Very much the foundational aspect that human life is sacred, every person has dignity, and that should be protected above all, this dignity of the human person, right? And so these the atrocities of abortion, euthanasia, death penalty, things like that, cloning, right? These are direct attacks on the dignity of human life. The church needs to be a sign and a safeguard of the dignity of the human person. We must, everything that we do is promoting and teaching and showing that every person has dignity, and that if you feel like you do not have that dignity, the church can help you to have that be restored in Christ. Right? Of course, dignity is never lost through poverty, age, gender, disability, race, ethnicity, lack of success. I think poverty and lack of success are huge in the United States. Of course, race, especially the history of the country. But the view of well, you're poor, you probably did something to deserve that, and you earn your success, and there's a worth there, and a dignity that's won or lost based on that, and the church fights against that. And again, this looking at the let's take for example the unborn fetus in the womb. It's not that life is more sacred. It's that life is more vulnerable and more directly attacked based on the policies in the country, right? Other things. I mean, if you say the phrase, not the movement itself, but the phrase, Black Lives Matter, it's not right. It's not saying that all lives don't matter, all lives aren't sacred. It says, hey, there's this segment of the population is more threatened right now, and so we're going to work to right those wrongs. But it's not saying that somehow lives are more sacred. It's what's under threat. All right, the second principle. They're called a family, community, and participation in that community, right? Human beings are social. We're built for relationship. So how do we protect marriage and the family and all these social institutions? How do we make sure they're not undermined, right? Everyone has a right and a duty to participate in society. How do we seek this common good? How do we live in society? How do we promote these building blocks of society, namely the family? The rights and responsibilities is number 3. Human dignity can be protected, and community can be achieved when human rights are being protected, and that we follow what we're responsible for. So the right to life, economic rights, political and cultural rights, which includes religious freedom, right? That list from Parliamentaries of all those rights, right? Those are protected, and then if we do those and we're responsible to those, we go a long way to protecting human dignity. And this is where this concept of subsidiarity falls in, right? As small as possible, but as big as it needs to be. All right, number 4, preferential option for the poor and vulnerable. And again, keep that in mind. I can't stress enough. It's not saying the poor are more sacred, but the poor are more vulnerable. They're more directly attacked. And so we're called to really call to mind, that the great parable of the Last Judgment of the sheep and the goats. When you're clothing the naked and feeding the poor, or feeding the hungry, visiting the sick, right? You're doing that for Christ, right? Christ is found in the poor, as he's found in anyone, but it's kind of in a special way in the poor, right? And this is not again just the material poor, but anyone who's marginalized, unborn children, people with disabilities, the elderly, and the terminally ill, and the victims of this injustice and oppression, especially through these structures of sin that exist. Here, this is a picture of a bishop, Bishop Quincanus, at the border of Mexico and Arizona, saying mass and giving communion to immigrants. The 5th principle is all about the dignity of work and the rights of workers. It was of course very big with Rerum Novarum and throughout of how the economy serves people. It's not the other way around. We don't exist just to work. There's a dignity in work, of course, but it's not just to make a living or there just to do something, but it's participating in God's creation. And so there's again, basic rights that need to be followed, that we are doing, that we could have a right to productive work, to wages, to fair wages, to private property, initiative, unions, things like that. This next one, solidarity, is, so we have subsidiarity of like looking at the small possible. So solidarity does kind of expand it and saying that there is this global aspect. There's this suffering with our brothers and sisters, that yes, I am my brother's keeper, right? Whatever our differences are, it's something that unites us, right? Human nature, or human race, right? If you want peace, work for justice. And there's this thing we're fighting for, the common good, that it's allowing not just as many people, but for everyone to flourish, either as groups or individuals, in the way that they can. There's a global dimension, welcoming the stranger among us. So immigrants who seek work, children of immigrants, they live a decent life, right? Solidarity is a huge aim when, say, if you go on a mission trip, right? It's not just to do these acts of charity, which are great and beautiful, but there's to be in relationship with the person, right? You don't go on a mission trip and you just build a house, and you never like interact with the people you're building the house for, or the people who are there, or you're working alongside, right? There's this connection that forms when you're on these mission trips. It's maybe just as important as doing the work itself, is you're forming these human bonds, right? You're connecting in this way, and in that way you're working for justice. And the last one is care for creation. It's not just some Earth Day slogan, or protect the earth, or reduce, recycle, all these things, but that it's we protect the planet because it's what we have to live on, and we do share it, right? There's moral and ethical dimensions of protecting the planet, right? So very much a move against Rene Descartes, who's one of the early modern philosophers. He's called the father of modern philosophy, but he had this aspect of that nature was something to be mastered and controlled and used. Well, certainly we use creation, and we're given creation, but it's through a gift, not through our domination of it. And so there's a respect that's called for. All right, that's all I have. And history has been made. I finish in an hour. Unbelievable, truly unbelievable. So next week, I did this one. Somehow I did this one. I'm like, oh my gosh, I wonder if I'll be able to do it again. A little deeper. So we finished in an hour. And so next week we'll talk all about Mary and the saints.